On the morning of February 10th, 1722, a man stood on the quarterdeck of a ship called the Royal Fortune, and he was wearing the wrong clothes for dying. The coat was crimson damask, cut long in the fashion of a gentleman, with gold thread worked through the seams in patterns that caught the weak morning light, filtering through the haze of the West African coast. Around his throat, a diamond cross hung from a heavy gold chain, not a cross worn in devotion, but a cross taken from the captain of a Portuguese vessel off the coast of Brazil, a man who had begged for his life in a language the wearer did not understand. The hat was black, wide-brimmed, cocked at an angle that suggested either supreme confidence or theatrical awareness. A brace of pistols hung from a silk sling across his chest. The silk was red. The pistols were loaded. His name was Bartholomew Roberts. He was 40 years old, which was ancient for his profession. He had been a pirate for precisely 3 years, 2 months, and 5 days, which was longer than most pirates survived. In that time, he had captured somewhere between 400 and 470 ships. The records disagree, and Roberts himself may not have kept precise count after the first 200. He had operated off 4 continents. He had brought the transatlantic slave trade to a temporary standstill. He had caused insurance rates at Lloyd's of London to spike so dramatically that merchants had petitioned Parliament for naval intervention. He had, by any reasonable measure, become the most successful pirate in the recorded history of the Atlantic Ocean. And on this particular morning, he was watching a ship come over the horizon that would kill him. The vessel, approaching through the morning haze, was called HMS Swallow. She was a 6th-rate frigate of the Royal Navy, carrying 50 guns and 280 men. Her captain was a Welshman named Challoner Ogle, who had spent the better part of a year hunting Roberts across 5,000 miles of ocean. The Swallow was not the largest ship in the Royal Navy. She was not the most heavily armed. She was not, by the standards of the great ships of the line that decided battles between nations, particularly impressive. But she was something else. She was something new. She was the future arriving at 24 knots with the wind at her back, and Bartholomew Roberts, standing on his quarterdeck in his crimson coat with his diamond cross catching the light, was the past. He did not know this. He could not have known it. He was looking at a ship, not a paradigm shift. He was looking at an enemy vessel, not the end of an era. He was calculating angles of approach, wind direction, the relative positions of his 3-ship flotilla, the state of his crew after a night of drinking captured wine. He was doing what he had always done, assessing a tactical situation with the cold pragmatism that had made him the most dangerous man on the Atlantic. What he was actually doing, what he had no possible way of understanding, was looking at his own extinction. This is the story of how a single class of warship hunted the most dangerous men on the ocean into extinction. It is the story of the frigate, a technological revolution wrapped in oak planking and canvas, a weapon system that seemed at first glance like merely another ship, but was in fact the answer to a question that had plagued maritime powers for a century. The question was simple. How do you catch men who do not want to be caught on an ocean that is 3,000 miles wide when those men are faster than you, more maneuverable than you, and have no fixed address? The answer, when it came, was not a policy. It was not a strategy. It was not a treaty or a proclamation or a moral awakening. The answer was a ship. The sources for what follows are imperfect, as sources for this period always are. We have Admiralty records from the British National Archives, logs, dispatches, court-martial transcripts, the paper trail of a bureaucracy that was beginning to understand the importance of documentation. We have A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 under the name Captain Charles Johnson, a text whose authorship remains disputed and whose reliability varies wildly from chapter to chapter. We have trial records from colonial courts, newspaper accounts from Boston and London and Kingston, letters from colonial governors begging for help that rarely came. We have ship's logs from both pirate vessels and the Navy ships that hunted them, though the pirate logs are sparse. These were not men who kept meticulous records. What we do not have and cannot recover are the perspectives of the men in the lower decks. The ordinary sailors who crewed both pirate vessels and naval frigates left almost no direct testimony. The enslaved Africans, whom pirates frequently captured, sometimes pressed into service, and often disposed of like cargo. Their voices are almost entirely absent from the record. We know that Roberts's crew, like most pirate crews of the period, included men of African descent, some formerly enslaved, some born free, some occupying ambiguous categories that the sources do not bother to clarify. We know their names only when they appear in trial records, and then usually only their first names, or their ship names, or the names others called them. This is a story told almost entirely from the perspective of the hunters and the hunted who left written traces. The others, the majority, probably, remain where the archive left them. What the sources do tell us, when read carefully, is a story about technology and adaptation, about the moment when the hunted became the prey, not because they lost their nerve or their skill, but because the tools arrayed against them finally caught up with the tools they had used to dominate. It is a story about what happens when innovation meets an adversary that has learned to read innovation and respond. It is a story about obsolescence. But to understand why the frigate killed the pirate, we must first understand why the pirate had been so difficult to kill in the first place. The golden age of piracy, that roughly 40-year period stretching from the late 1680s through the early 1730s, was not a romantic adventure. It was an economic phenomenon that emerged from a specific convergence of circumstances that had never existed before and would never exist again. To understand it, you must first understand the ocean as it existed in 1700, not a body of water connected by shipping lanes and patrol schedules, but a vast and almost entirely unpoliced wilderness. The Atlantic of 1700 was 3,000 miles wide. A ship sailing from the African coast to the Caribbean might spend 6 to 8 weeks at sea without sighting another vessel. A ship working the American coastline from Newfoundland to the Bahamas might encounter a Royal Navy patrol once in a sailing season, if at all. The mathematics of coverage were simply impossible. The British Navy in 1700 consisted of roughly 270 ships of all classes, responsible for defending an empire that stretched from the English Channel to the Indian Ocean. The Western Atlantic Station, responsible for the Caribbean, the American coast, and the shipping lanes connecting them, might have 8 to 12 ships assigned at any given time, covering an area of approximately 10 million square miles. The pirates understood this mathematics intuitively. They did not need to defeat the Royal Navy. They did not need to outgun it, or outfight it, or outman it. They simply needed to not be where it was. In 10 million square miles of ocean, with shipping lanes that scattered across hundreds of possible routes, the odds of encountering a naval patrol were negligible. A pirate captain who paid attention to wind patterns, seasonal shipping movements, and the published schedules of naval convoys could operate for years without ever seeing a warship. And when they did see one, they could run. This was the second factor that made piracy possible: the ships themselves. The archetypal pirate vessel of the Golden Age was not a purpose-built warship, but a converted merchant ship, a sloop, a brigantine, or occasionally a captured merchantman refitted for speed. These vessels shared a common characteristic. They were fast, they were maneuverable, and they sat shallow in the water. A pirate sloop drawing 8 feet could sail into harbors and inlets, where a ship of the line drawing 20 feet could not follow. She could turn faster, tack closer to the wind, and sprint away from heavier vessels that could not match her speed in light airs. The mathematics of pursuit were as favorable to the pirates as the mathematics of patrol. A warship that spotted a pirate vessel at dawn might spend all day in chase and never close the gap. As darkness fell, the pirate would alter course, run without lights, and be 40 miles away by morning in a direction the warship could only guess. The ocean was too large. The pirates were too fast. The window of engagement was too narrow. This was not a secret. The Admiralty understood it. Colonial governors wrote desperate letters about it. Merchants' associations funded private expeditions to address it. But understanding a problem is not the same as solving it. For the better part of 4 decades, the great maritime powers of Europe, Britain, France, Spain, were effectively outmaneuvered by small crews of desperate men in converted cargo ships. The pirates were not better sailors than the naval officers who hunted them. They were not braver, though many of them were brave. They were not more skillful, though many of them were skillful. What they were was better adapted. Their vessels, their tactics, and their entire operational model had evolved to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of the system arrayed against them. They were, in the language of a later century, an asymmetric threat, and for 40 years no one could figure out what to do about them. Enter Bartholomew Roberts. Roberts was not born a pirate. No one was. He was born John Roberts in the village of Casnewid Bach in Pembrokeshire, Wales, sometime around 1682. The records do not specify the date. He went to sea young, as boys from coastal Welsh villages often did, and by his late 30s he had worked his way up to the position of third mate on a slave ship called the Princess, operating off the West African coast. He was competent, experienced, literate, and respectable. He was also, in the summer of 1719, about to become something else entirely. In June of that year, the Princess was anchored at Anomabu, on what is now the coast of Ghana, loading human cargo for transport to the Americas. A pirate vessel appeared in the harbor, a ship called the Royal Rover, commanded by a Welshman named Howell Davis. Davis had been a pirate for less than a year, but he had already developed a reputation for theatrical audacity and calculated violence. He captured the Princess without significant resistance, as slave ships generally preferred to surrender their cargo rather than fight. Among the crew he pressed into service was the Princess's third mate, Bartholomew Roberts. What happened next is recorded in multiple sources but remains somewhat mysterious in its motivations. Roberts was offered a choice: join the pirate crew or be set adrift in a small boat off a hostile coast. He chose to join. Within 6 weeks, Howell Davis was dead, killed in an ambush by Portuguese soldiers on the island of Principe. The pirates needed a new captain. They elected Roberts. He had been a pirate for 6 weeks. He had no experience in command. He had never, so far as the records indicate, committed an act of violence against another human being. He was a middle-aged merchant sailor with respectable ambitions and a background in logistics. Within 3 years, he would be the most wanted man on the Atlantic Ocean. The transformation of John Roberts into Black Bart, a name he may never have used himself, is one of the most remarkable adaptations in the history of maritime crime. He applied to piracy the same methodical competence he had applied to the slave trade. He developed a code of conduct for his crew that regulated everything from the distribution of plunder to the resolution of disputes. He instituted a form of disability insurance. Crew members who lost limbs in combat received specified compensations from the communal treasury. He banned gambling and drinking after 8 o'clock in the evening. He required musicians aboard his vessels to rest on the Sabbath. These regulations were not the romantic rules of a pirate utopia. They were operational procedures designed to maintain discipline, prevent the kind of drunken chaos that had doomed other pirate crews, and ensure that his ships functioned as coherent fighting units rather than floating mobs. Roberts ran his fleet the way a competent merchant captain ran a shipping operation, with schedules, with structure, with clearly defined responsibilities and predictable incentives. And it worked. Within 18 months of taking command, Roberts had captured over 100 ships. By the end of his second year, he had disrupted shipping from Brazil to Newfoundland. By the time the Swallow appeared on the morning of February 10, 1722, he had operated continuously for over 3 years, an almost unprecedented run in a profession where the average career lasted months, not years. He had survived for so long because he understood, with perfect clarity, the weaknesses of the system arrayed against him. He never stayed in one area long enough for naval patrols to concentrate. He moved constantly, from the African coast to Brazil, from Brazil to the Caribbean, from the Caribbean to Newfoundland, from Newfoundland back to Africa. He struck fast and moved faster. He learned to read the seasonal rhythms of merchant shipping and positioned himself along routes that he knew would be crowded with prizes and empty of warships. He developed an intelligence network among the captains he captured, questioning them carefully about naval movements, shipping schedules, and the locations of valuable cargoes. He was, in short, a professional, and for 3 years, professionalism was enough. But while Roberts was perfecting the art of piracy, the Royal Navy was perfecting something else. The frigate, as a distinct class of warship, did not spring fully formed from a single designer's imagination. It evolved, over the course of roughly a century, from a series of experimental solutions to a persistent problem. How do you build a ship that is fast enough to catch pirates and raiders, but powerful enough to fight when it catches them? The traditional ships of the line, the great first rates and second rates that decided battles between fleets, were utterly unsuited to the task. They were floating fortresses, massive, heavily armed, and slow. A first-rate ship of the line might carry 100 guns and a crew of 800 men, but she drew 30 feet of water and moved through light airs like a city block learning to swim. She was designed for fleet actions, for the hammer-blow battles where nations settled their differences in smoke and thunder. She was not designed to chase a sloop through shoal waters. At the other end of the spectrum were the small patrol vessels, cutters, ketches, sloops of war, that the Navy had traditionally used for coastal patrol and dispatch duties. These ships were fast enough to catch pirates, but they were too small to fight them. A naval cutter carrying 10 guns and 40 men might encounter a pirate sloop carrying 20 guns and 150 men. The mathematics of that encounter favored the pirate. Speed without firepower was simply a faster way to die. The frigate emerged from this dilemma. She was a compromise, but she was a compromise that worked. A sixth-rate frigate like the Swallow carried between 28 and 50 guns, enough firepower to overpower any pirate vessel, but not so much weight that she sacrificed speed. She drew 15 to 18 feet of water, shallow enough to pursue pirates into harbors and inlets where deeper vessels could not follow. Her hull was designed for speed, a length-to-beam ratio that prioritized straight-line performance over cargo capacity. Her rigging was optimized for rapid handling. A crew could bring her about or set additional canvas faster than the crews of the great ships of the line, who wrestled with acres of sail and miles of rope. Most importantly, she was designed to hunt, not to patrol, not to convoy, to pursue single targets across thousands of miles of ocean, identify them, close with them, and destroy them. The Swallow was not the first frigate. Ships of similar design had been in service since the late 17th century, and the concept had been refined through decades of trial and error. But by the 1720s, the frigate had reached a level of maturity that made it genuinely dangerous to the kind of men Roberts represented. The Swallow was the product of 100 years of accumulated shipbuilding knowledge, of lessons learned from failed pursuits and lost engagements. She was not just a ship. She was an argument that had been refined until it was lethal. Her captain, Challoner Ogle, understood his weapon. He was a career naval officer, 40 years old, the same age as Roberts, with nearly 3 decades of service behind him. He had been given command of the Swallow specifically because of his reputation for methodical persistence. The Admiralty had not sent him to the African coast to show the flag or to protect convoys. They had sent him to find Roberts and kill him. Ogle had been hunting for months. He had tracked rumors and interrogated captured merchants and followed the debris trail that Roberts left behind. The burned hulks, the looted harbors, the terrified colonial officials. He had learned Roberts' patterns, the way he moved from coast to coast with the seasons, the way he preferred to operate in threes with a consort vessel for support, the way he anchored in specific harbors for careening and repair. Ogle had studied his quarry the way a wolf studies a deer. He knew how Roberts moved. He knew where Roberts liked to be at specific times of year. He knew by February of 1722 that Roberts was somewhere on the coast of Huida, probably with multiple prizes, probably with a crew debilitated by drink and the long months at sea. He knew, in other words, that his moment had come. The morning of February 10th, 1722, broke gray and hazy off Cape Lopez, in what is now Gabon. Roberts had anchored his small fleet in the bay, 3 ships, the Royal Fortune, the Ranger, and a recently captured prize, to clean their hulls and make repairs. It was a routine stop, the kind of maintenance that kept wooden ships functional in tropical waters where barnacles and worms could reduce a vessel's speed by half in a matter of months. Roberts's crew was not in fighting condition. They had taken a prize the night before, a trading vessel loaded with wine and provisions, and had celebrated in the manner pirates typically celebrated, by drinking themselves into stupefaction. The ship's musician, records suggest, had played until well past midnight. Men who should have been standing watch, were instead sprawled across the decks, sleeping off the previous night's debauchery. The few lookouts who remained alert were watching for merchants, not warships. What they saw, as the haze began to lift around 9 in the morning, was a single ship rounding the cape to the south. The initial assessment was encouraging. The approaching vessel looked like a merchant, a Portuguese trader perhaps, or an English slave ship making for the coast. She was moving slowly, as if uncertain of the anchorage. Her gun ports appeared to be closed. Roberts, notified by a bleary-eyed officer, came on deck to observe. What Roberts was actually looking at was the Swallow. With her gun ports deliberately sealed and her pace deliberately slowed, a hunter pretending to be prey. Ogle had planned this moment for weeks. He knew that pirates typically responded to the appearance of a merchant vessel by giving chase. The predatory instinct was too strong, and the potential for prize money too attractive to resist. He had deliberately approached in a manner calculated to look helpless, to draw out one of Roberts's ships in pursuit while avoiding the appearance of a threat that might cause the entire flotilla to flee. It worked. The Ranger, captained by one of Roberts's subordinates, slipped her anchor cable and moved to intercept. She was faster than the Swallow, or appeared to be. She began to close the gap. Ogle let her come. For 6 hours, the chase continued. The Swallow seemed to flee, but her flight was calculated, fast enough to maintain the illusion of a terrified merchantman, slow enough to prevent the Ranger from giving up. Mile by mile, Ogle drew the pirate vessel away from Cape Lopez, away from Roberts, away from any possibility of support. By mid-afternoon, the two ships were out of sight of land. Then the Swallow turned. What happened next was not a battle. It was an execution. The Swallow's gun ports opened simultaneously, revealing 48 guns on 2 decks. The frigate came about with a precision that the Ranger's drunken crew could not match. The first broadside shattered the pirate's foremast and killed 10 men in the opening seconds. The second broadside swept her deck with grape shot, turning men into wreckage. The Ranger's captain, a man named James Skyarm, tried to bring his ship about to return fire, but the Swallow's superior speed allowed Ogle to position himself where the pirate's guns could not bear. Within an hour, the Ranger was a drifting wreck. Her masts were gone. Her deck was covered with dead and dying men. Her crew, those still capable of movement, threw down their weapons and called for quarter. Ogle took possession of the vessel, chained the survivors below decks, and began the process of temporary repairs. Then, he turned back toward Cape Lopez. Roberts, meanwhile, had watched the Ranger sail over the horizon in pursuit of what he believed was a merchant prize. He had no reason for concern. His subordinate was chasing a slow trader in a fast ship. The mathematics of such pursuits were simple and reliable. By evening, he expected to see the Ranger return with another captured vessel in tow. More wine, more supplies, more plunder to divide among his crew. By evening, he would be dead. The sources disagree about what Roberts knew and when he knew it. Some accounts suggest that he realized the truth when the Swallow failed to appear on the horizon alongside the returning Ranger, that the continued absence of both vessels implied something had gone wrong. Other accounts suggest he remained oblivious until the following morning when the Swallow herself appeared off Cape Lopez, no longer disguised, her battle flags flying, her guns run out and ready. What the sources agree on is this: when Bartholomew Roberts finally understood what was happening, his response was characteristic. He ordered his crew to action stations. He directed them to slip the anchor cables rather than waste time hauling them in. He brought his ships about to engage the approaching frigate with the wind at his back, the one tactical advantage still available to him. He put on his finest clothes, the crimson damask coat, the diamond cross, the silk sash with its brace of pistols. He ordered breakfast served to his officers as though this were an ordinary morning and not the last morning of his life. Some historians have interpreted this behavior as bravado, or fatalism, or theatrical self-mythology. Perhaps it was all of these. But it was also something more pragmatic. Roberts was a professional. He had calculated odds for 3 years, and the odds he was now facing were not impossible. The Swallow was a single ship. Roberts had 2, the Royal Fortune and the Little Ranger, a smaller consort. If he could coordinate his fire, if his crew could sober up quickly enough to work the guns effectively, if the wind held in his favor, he might still escape. Or he might inflict enough damage on the Swallow to force her to break off and make repairs, buying time for the pirates to flee. The calculation was wrong, but it was a calculation, not a surrender. At 10 in the morning, the Swallow came within range. The Royal Fortune fired first, a ragged broadside that did minimal damage, betraying the crew's condition. The Swallow's return fire was precise, concentrated, devastatingly accurate. Her gun crews had been trained for exactly this moment. Her officers had drilled exactly this scenario. She was not a ship manned by drunk men who had been sleeping off a party 12 hours earlier. She was a weapon system operating at designed capacity. The first exchange killed Bartholomew Roberts. He was standing at the rail, observing the enemy vessel, when a grape-shot round caught him in the throat. He fell against the deck tackle, then slid to the planking. His crew, seeing their captain collapse, paused in what they were doing, a fatal hesitation that lasted only seconds, but allowed the Swallow to reload and fire again. Roberts's standing orders had been explicit. If he died in combat, his body was to be thrown overboard, weighted with whatever was available, to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. His crew obeyed. Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the Atlantic's golden age, went into the water off Cape Lopez sometime before 11 in the morning on February 10, 1722. His body was never recovered. The diamond cross, the crimson coat, the silk sash and its pistols, all of it went with him, falling through the Atlantic darkness until it reached a bottom that holds it still. The battle continued without him, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Royal Fortune's crew fought for another 2 hours, not out of hope, but out of the grim awareness that surrender meant the gallows. Some of them tried to reach the ship's powder magazine to blow the vessel up and take the Swallow with her, a final act of spite that might have killed hundreds of men on both sides. They were stopped by other crew members who wanted to live, even if living meant a trial and a rope. By noon, it was over. The Royal Fortune struck her colors. The survivors, 169 men, were taken into custody. They would be transported to Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast, where the largest pirate trial in history would begin in March. Of the 169 men captured that day, 52 would be hanged, 17 would be sentenced to 7 years' servitude in the Royal African Company's mines, a slower form of death, but death nonetheless. 20 were acquitted, able to prove they had been pressed into pirate service against their will. 70 Africans captured alongside the crew were returned to slavery, their brief and ambiguous freedom aboard Roberts's ships ended by the same ropes that freed them from chains. The trial records survive. They are detailed, methodical, bureaucratic, the voice of an empire demonstrating that it could reach across 3,000 miles of ocean to enforce its laws. They record names, ages, places of origin, specific acts of piracy, the value of cargoes taken. They record defenses offered and rejected. They record the words spoken by condemned men in the moments before their execution. They do not record what Challoner Ogle was thinking as he watched the hangings from the deck of his ship. But we can infer something of his understanding of what he had accomplished. The death of Bartholomew Roberts did not end piracy in the Atlantic. Other pirates would continue to operate for another decade, in diminishing numbers, with diminishing success. But something had shifted on the morning of February 10, 1722. The balance of power that had favored the pirates for 40 years had finally tipped. The frigate, that compromise between speed and firepower, that instrument designed specifically to solve the problem of men like Roberts, had proven itself. Ogle would be knighted for his service. He was the only Royal Navy officer in history to receive a knighthood for an action against pirates. The honor was not romantic. It was bureaucratic. It was the Admiralty acknowledging that a long and expensive problem had finally been solved. The solution was not a policy. It was not a treaty. It was not a moral awakening or a change in economic conditions or a shift in the demographics of maritime labor. The solution was a ship. The frigate had caught the uncatchable. She had matched the pirates' speed, exceeded their firepower, and maintained the discipline that drunken pirate crews could not match in moments of crisis. She was the answer to the question that had plagued maritime commerce for decades. And the pirates, whose entire operational model depended on being faster than whatever was chasing them, discovered too late that they were no longer fast enough. What follows is the story of that discovery, of the technology that made it possible, of the men who developed it, and of the pirates who watched it come over the horizon on gray mornings off West African coasts, understanding finally that the sea had been claimed by something more powerful than themselves. It is a story about the death of an era. It is a story about what happens when adaptation fails, when the evolutionary niche that sustained a way of life closes forever. It is a story about obsolescence. But it is also a story about the men who became obsolete, who they were, why they chose the lives they chose, and what they saw when they looked at the ships that killed them. Roberts saw the Swallow for perhaps 40 minutes before it killed him. In those 40 minutes, he made decisions, issued orders, put on his finest clothes. He died in crimson damask because he chose to. He died facing the enemy because he chose to. The frigate was faster. The frigate was better. The frigate was the future. But for 40 minutes, Roberts was still the most dangerous man on the Atlantic Ocean. The question of what makes a man dangerous is not as simple as it sounds. Roberts was dangerous because he was competent, because he was sober, because he understood the mathematics of predation better than anyone who had practiced the trade before him. But his danger was contingent. It depended on conditions that he did not create and could not preserve. He was dangerous in the same way that a wolf is dangerous, genuinely lethal within a specific ecological niche, helpless the moment that niche closes. The niche that made Atlantic piracy possible was a gap. It was the space between what maritime commerce required and what maritime enforcement could provide. For most of the 17th century and the first 2 decades of the 18th, that gap was enormous. Ships carrying valuable cargo crossed vast stretches of ocean with no protection. Naval vessels that could have provided that protection were too few, too slow, or too far away. The pirates lived in that gap. They fed on it. They grew powerful because the gap grew with them, widening with every expansion of colonial trade. To understand the frigate, to understand what it meant for men like Roberts, you have to understand the gap it was designed to close. Consider the Atlantic Ocean of 1700. It is not the ocean of charts and shipping lanes that a modern viewer might imagine. It is 3,000 miles of water connecting 4 continents in a web of trade routes that no single power fully controls. Spanish galleons carry silver from the Americas to Seville. Portuguese slavers carry human beings from West Africa to Brazil. English merchantmen carry sugar from Barbados to Bristol, manufactured goods from London to the colonies, and increasingly enslaved people from Africa to everywhere. Dutch traders work the margins, French traders work the margins, and 100 smaller operations fill in the spaces between the great commercial powers. All of this traffic moves in ships that are, by the standards of later centuries, absurdly vulnerable. The average merchant vessel of 1700 carries a crew of perhaps 12 to 20 men. She mounts a few guns, 4, 6, maybe 8, but her crew cannot work them effectively while also sailing the ship. Her captain is a commercial operator, not a military commander. He is paid to move cargo, not to fight. If he encounters a pirate ship with 40 men and a dozen guns, his options are limited. He can run if his ship is fast enough, which it probably is not. He can fight if he wants to see his crew killed for cargo that belongs to his employers. Or he can surrender, which is what most captains do, because it is the rational choice, because fighting pirates is not his job. The pirates understood this calculation perfectly. They did not need to be brave. They did not need to be skilled in combat. They needed to be present, to appear on the horizon with enough visible force that the rational calculation favored surrender. Most pirate engagements involved no fighting at all. The merchant captain assessed the odds, struck his colors, and handed over his cargo. The pirates took what they wanted, sometimes recruited crew members who preferred piracy to honest wages, and sailed away to do it again. This was the business model. It was remarkably efficient. A single pirate crew could take dozens of ships in a year, accumulating wealth that would have taken a lifetime to earn through legitimate labor. The model had one requirement: the pirates had to be able to appear and disappear without being caught by anyone capable of stopping them. For decades, they could. The naval vessels tasked with protecting colonial commerce were what historians call fourth rates and fifth rates, Large ships, heavily armed, designed for fleet actions against other navies rather than for chasing individual raiders. They mounted 50 or 60 guns, carried crews of 300 men, and required enormous quantities of supplies to stay at sea. They were slow, they were expensive. They could not be everywhere at once, and they could not catch anything that chose to run from them. When a fourth raid appeared in Caribbean waters, the pirates simply left. They sailed to Madagascar. They sailed to West Africa. They sailed to the North American coast. The Atlantic was large enough that staying out of reach required only patience and a willingness to move. The naval commanders wrote frustrated dispatches to the Admiralty, explaining that they could not find pirates who did not want to be found, that the ocean was too vast and their ships too few. This was the situation that produced the Golden Age. It was not a failure of will. It was not a failure of law. It was a failure of technology. The ships that could defeat pirates could not catch them. The ships that could catch pirates could not defeat them. The pirates lived in the space between speed and firepower, and as long as that space existed, piracy would flourish. The frigate closed that space. The word itself is old, dating to the Mediterranean galley designs of the 16th century. But the vessel that hunted down Bartholomew Roberts, the ship type that the Swallow represented, was something new. She was a purpose-built predator, designed from the keel up to solve a specific problem. The problem was men like Roberts. The solution was a ship that could do what no previous warship could do, sail as fast as a pirate while fighting like a man of war. The mathematics of ship design in the age of sail involved brutal trade-offs. Speed required a hull that was long relative to its beam. The longer and narrower a ship, the faster she could move through water. But guns required stability, which meant a wider beam, a deeper draft, a hull shape that resisted the recoil of broadsides. A ship that was fast enough to catch a fleeing pirate would roll dangerously when she fired her guns. A ship that was stable enough to deliver accurate broadsides would be too slow to catch anything that ran. The frigate designers found a compromise. They accepted that they could not have everything, could not have the firepower of a ship of the line or the speed of a sloop. What they could have was enough of both. A frigate might carry 30 guns instead of 60. She might require a crew of 200 instead of 300. She might not be able to stand in a battle line against a French or Spanish fleet, but she could catch a pirate sloop. She could catch a converted merchantman. She could catch anything that was running from her, and when she caught it, she could pound it into submission without the pirate being able to respond effectively. The Swallow that killed Roberts was a fifth-rate frigate of 50 guns, larger than a true frigate, but carrying the frigate's essential DNA. She was fast enough. She was armed enough. She was crewed by men who had been trained to fight, not just sail. When Roberts saw her hull coming over the horizon on that February morning, he was seeing the future of maritime enforcement. He did not know that he was seeing the future. He thought he was seeing one dangerous enemy, one naval vessel that he would either outrun or outfight. What he was actually seeing was a proof of concept. The Admiralty had spent decades building ships like the Swallow, deploying them to colonial waters, testing them against the specific threat that pirates represented. The Swallow was not an accident. She was the product of deliberate engineering, careful budgeting, and accumulated experience. She was what the Empire looked like when it decided that a problem needed solving. The development of the frigate was not a single invention, but an evolution. The process began in the 1650s, when English shipwrights started experimenting with smaller, faster warships that could operate independently of the main battle fleet. These early frigates were designed for scouting, for carrying dispatches, for harassing enemy commerce, not for hunting pirates. But the design principles they established would prove applicable to the pirate problem as it emerged half a century later. By the 1690s, the Admiralty was commissioning fifth rates specifically for colonial deployment. These ships were too small to contribute meaningfully to European fleet actions, but they were ideal for Caribbean and Atlantic patrol duty. They could stay at sea for extended periods. They could enter shallow harbors that larger ships could not navigate. They could chase merchant vessels, or former merchant vessels that had turned pirate, without the ponderous maneuvering that made ships of the line useless for pursuit. The men who commanded these early frigates learned through trial and error what worked against pirates. They learned that speed mattered more than firepower, that a pirate who escaped today would be killing merchants tomorrow, while a pirate who was caught and engaged could be destroyed even with inferior armament. They learned that endurance mattered, that pirates could be worn down through persistent pursuit, even if they could not be caught in a single chase. They learned that coordination mattered, that multiple frigates working together could herd a pirate into a trap, blocking escape routes until the quarry had nowhere to run. These lessons were recorded in dispatches, discussed at the Admiralty, incorporated into the next generation of ship designs. The frigates of 1720 were measurably faster than the frigates of 1700, not because of any single breakthrough, but because of accumulated refinement. Hull shapes were optimized, rigging was improved, the ratio of sail area to displacement was carefully calibrated. Each new ship incorporated the lessons of the ships that had come before. Challenger Ogle, commanding the Swallow off the West African coast, was the beneficiary of this decades-long process. He did not invent the frigate, he did not design his ship, he did not train the men who built her or calculate the mathematics of her hull, but he inherited their work, and he used it to kill the most successful pirate in Atlantic history. The pursuit itself, what happened in the hours before Roberts died, deserves close examination. It reveals the frigate in action, demonstrates why the design worked, and shows what the pirates experienced in their final encounters with the technology that destroyed them. The Swallow had been hunting Roberts for months. Ogle knew the general area where the pirate fleet was operating, the stretch of West African coast between Cape Lopez and Whydah, where the slave trade concentrated the shipping that Roberts preyed upon. But knowing the area and finding the specific ships were different problems. The coast was long, the harbors were numerous. Roberts could be anywhere within 500 miles of coastline, and the Swallow could only be in one place at a time. Ogle's solution was patient cruising. He worked the coast systematically, putting into harbors, gathering intelligence from local traders and company factors, building a picture of where Roberts had been and where he might be going. This kind of intelligence work was itself a product of institutional development, the network of informants and commercial agents that could tell a naval officer where pirates were operating. Roberts was not invisible. He was simply moving in a vast space. Ogle's task was to narrow that space, to anticipate where Roberts would appear, and to be there when he did. On February 5th, 1722, Ogle found his quarry, or rather, he found part of it. Roberts's fleet had captured a French ship and sent her to Cape Lopez for cleaning and provisioning. The captured vessel was accompanied by one of Roberts's consort ships, commanded by a pirate named Skyarm. The main body of the fleet, including Roberts himself, was somewhere nearby but not visible. Ogle made a decision that demonstrated the tactical thinking that frigate commanders had developed. He did not immediately engage. Instead, he approached slowly, flying French colors, pretending to be a merchantman seeking trade. The pirates took the bait. Skyarm's ship began moving to intercept what appeared to be easy prey. Only when the pirate was fully committed did Ogle reveal himself. He ran up English colors. He opened fire. The engagement that followed was brutal but brief. Skyarm's vessel, the Ranger, was outgunned and outcrewed. Her men fought because pirate crews knew that surrender meant the gallows, but they fought without hope. After 2 hours of running battle, the Ranger struck her colors. Skyarm himself lost a leg to a cannonball and died of his wounds. The Swallow had taken her first prize, but the main objective, Roberts himself, was still at large. Ogle knew that the pirate captain would learn of the Ranger's capture within days, perhaps hours. He would know that a powerful enemy was in the area. He would run. What Ogle did next was counterintuitive. Instead of pursuing immediately, he withdrew. He took his prize to a safe distance, secured his prisoners, and repaired the damage his ship had sustained. He spent 5 days on these tasks, 5 days during which Roberts could have fled to safety, could have sailed for Madagascar or the Caribbean or anywhere beyond pursuit. But Ogle understood something about pirates that Roberts may not have understood about himself. Pirates were predators, and predators returned to where prey was abundant. The slave coast was Roberts' hunting ground. The convoys gathering there were too valuable to abandon. Ogle gambled that Roberts' greed, or his confidence, or his defiance would bring him back. The gamble paid. On the morning of February 10th, 1722, the Swallow found Roberts's fleet at anchor off Cape Lopez. 3 ships, the Royal Fortune, now mounting 40 guns and carrying perhaps 200 men, a captured French vessel, and a small sloop. The pirates were not ready. Many of them were drunk from the previous night's celebrations. Roberts himself had been awake through the night, interrogating the captain of a captured vessel. The Swallow appeared at dawn. At first, the pirates mistook her for a Portuguese merchantman, another fat prize wandering into their hunting ground. But Roberts knew. Roberts understood ships in a way that drunk lookouts did not. He saw the Swallow's lines, her rig, the way she moved through the water. He recognized a predator. What happened in the next 40 minutes was a compression of everything that made Roberts who he was, and everything that made the frigate what it was. Roberts issued orders with perfect clarity. He called his men to quarters. He ordered the anchor cables cut. No time to weigh anchor properly. He commanded his crew to make sail. He intended to run past the Swallow, to use the weather gauge, to escape into the open Atlantic, where his knowledge of winds and currents might give him an advantage. It was the right strategy. It was the strategy that had worked for him dozens of times before. But the Swallow was faster. That was the fact that undid everything. As Roberts's Royal Fortune gathered speed, Ogle's frigate matched her. As Roberts adjusted his course, Ogle adjusted his. The gap between them was not closing quickly, but it was closing. Roberts could see it, could calculate the mathematics of pursuit, and know that he would not make open water before the Swallow was in range. He made a decision. Instead of running, he would fight. He ordered his helmsman to turn toward the enemy, to close the distance, to bring his broadside to bear before the Swallow could choose her moment of engagement. It was a pirate's decision, aggressive, immediate, relying on shock and violence to overcome disadvantage. In another context, against another enemy, it might have worked. Roberts had won battles this way before. He had intimidated captains into surrender by the sheer audacity of his approach. But Ogle was not a merchant captain. Ogle was a frigate commander with a trained crew and 30 years of institutional knowledge behind him. He did not flinch. He did not recalculate. He waited until the Royal Fortune was committed to her closing course, and then he delivered his broadside. The guns of a frigate spoke differently than the guns of a converted merchantman. They spoke in disciplined sequence, each gun crew firing in turn, maintaining a steady rhythm of destruction that could be sustained for hours if necessary. The pirates fired back, but their gunnery was wild, undisciplined, the product of enthusiasm rather than training. Some of their shots struck the Swallow's rigging, most missed entirely. Roberts was on deck in his crimson damask, directing his crew, showing the colors that had terrified 100 merchant captains. A grape-shot cluster struck him in the throat. He died within minutes, according to some accounts within seconds. His men threw his body overboard, honoring the preference he had often expressed. Better the sea than the hangman. With Roberts dead, the fight went out of his crew. Some continued to fire, but without coordination, without purpose. Others began drinking, deciding that if they were going to die, they would die insensible. Within 2 hours, the Royal Fortune struck her colors. The most successful pirate career in Atlantic history ended not with a legendary last stand, but with a swift, methodical execution by a ship designed specifically to make such executions possible. The frigate had done what it was built to do. In the months that followed, the Swallow would complete the destruction of Roberts's network. She captured his consort vessels. She transported his crew to trial. She demonstrated to every pirate operating in Atlantic waters that the rules had changed, that the gap they had lived in was closing, that the mathematics of predation no longer favored them. Other frigates were doing the same work elsewhere. In the Caribbean, the HMS Rose and the HMS Shoreham hunted through the islands, catching pirates who had operated with impunity for years. In the North American colonies, vessels like the HMS Pearl patrolled the coasts, intercepting raiders who had once used the vast shoreline as a sanctuary. The network of enforcement that had been inadequate in 1700 was becoming adequate by 1725, and the adequacy was measured in frigate hulls. The pirates adapted, as predators always do when their environment changes. They moved to more remote waters, to the Indian Ocean, to the Red Sea, to the coast of Madagascar, where the Royal Navy's reach was still limited. They reduced their operations, taking fewer ships, staying at sea for shorter periods, trying to avoid the attention that would bring frigates hunting. They stopped building fleets. A large pirate fleet was a target, visible from miles away, impossible to hide. Smaller operations might survive, smaller operations might slip through, but smaller operations could not sustain the lifestyle that had attracted men to piracy in the first place. The Golden Age had promised wealth, freedom, and a kind of brutal democracy that life ashore could not offer. A pirate sloop with 20 men, skulking along colonial coasts and taking only the smallest prizes, offered none of these things. The trade that had drawn thousands of men was becoming something marginal, desperate, and poor. By 1730, the Atlantic piracy that had terrorized maritime commerce for half a century was effectively over. Individual pirates would continue to operate for years, would continue to operate in diminishing forms for centuries. But the great age of the pirate captain, the age of Roberts and Blackbeard and Charles Vane and Stede Bonnet, was finished. The frigate had finished it. What the pirates left behind was a different world than the one they had entered. The shipping lanes they had terrorized were safer, more predictable, more profitable for legitimate commerce. The colonial governments they had defied were stronger, more organized, more capable of projecting force across vast oceanic distances. The Royal Navy they had evaded had grown into an institution that would dominate the world's oceans for the next 2 centuries. In a sense, the pirates had contributed to their own destruction. By making maritime commerce so dangerous, they had forced the colonial powers to invest in the enforcement mechanisms that would eventually destroy them. Every ship Roberts took, every cargo he burned, every town he terrified, each of these was an argument for more frigates, more naval stations, more coordination between colonial governors. The pirates were an evolutionary pressure, and the empire evolved to meet them. The evolution was not uniform. It did not proceed at the same pace across all waters, nor did it eliminate piracy in the same way everywhere. What the frigate accomplished in the Atlantic by 1730 would take another century to accomplish in the Indian Ocean, and longer still in the South China Sea. The world's oceans were not a single body of water subject to a single authority, but a patchwork of jurisdictions, capacities, and priorities, each shaped by different configurations of power. The story of the frigate's triumph is therefore also the story of where the frigate was not, of the gaps that remained, the sanctuaries that persisted, the places where the mathematics of predation still occasionally favored the predator. But even as we trace these limits, we must recognize what had fundamentally changed. The frigate had proven that piracy was not an inevitable condition of maritime commerce. It was not a force of nature, like storms or currents, that sailors simply had to accept. It was a human phenomenon produced by specific conditions, and those conditions could be altered by sufficient investment, sufficient coordination, sufficient force. The deaths of Roberts and Blackbeard, and the hundreds of lesser pirates who swung from gallows across the Atlantic, were not just punishments. They were demonstrations. They showed that the state, when it chose to act, could reach even the most remote corners of the ocean. They showed that freedom from law was always temporary, always conditional on the law's inattention. They showed that the sea, which had seemed so vast and ungovernable, could be governed after all. The implications extended far beyond piracy. If the ocean could be policed, it could be organized. If it could be organized, it could be optimized. The same naval presence that eliminated pirates also suppressed smuggling, enforced trade regulations, protected colonial monopolies. The frigate was not just a predator hunter. It was an instrument of economic control. Its presence in colonial waters meant that commerce flowed through approved channels, that customs duties were collected, that the wealth extracted from colonial territories reached the metropolitan centers, rather than dispersing into pirate holds and smuggler coves. The ship that killed Bartholomew Roberts also helped build the British Empire. This is not an accident of history. The frigate was developed as a tool of imperial consolidation, precisely because piracy and imperial weakness were two expressions of the same underlying condition. Both arose from the gap between claimed sovereignty and actual control. A government that could not suppress piracy could not enforce trade policy. A government that could not enforce trade policy could not extract the surplus that funded further expansion. The frigate closed the gap, turned claimed sovereignty into actual sovereignty, transformed the theoretical empire into a functional one. The pirates themselves understood this, at least dimly. Their rhetoric, preserved in the few documents that survive from pirate crews, was often explicitly anti-imperial. They spoke of themselves as men who had rejected the tyranny of kings and the exploitation of merchants. They organized their ships as democracies at a time when democracy was a marginal and dangerous idea. They distributed plunder according to written articles that specified shares and compensation for injuries, creating a kind of workers' compensation system decades before such things existed on legitimate vessels. Some historians have seen in these practices a prefiguring of later radical movements, a floating utopia that challenged the hierarchies of the shore. The interpretation is romantic, and like most romantic interpretations, it contains truth wrapped in distortion. The pirates did create alternative social arrangements. They did reject the authority that governed life on land and on legitimate ships. They did, in their brief chaotic way, demonstrate that other ways of organizing human labor were possible. But they also enslaved Africans when convenient, massacred resistors when profitable, and betrayed each other with the same regularity as any other group of humans operating under conditions of violence and scarcity. Their democracy was a democracy of armed men, and it excluded everyone those armed men chose to exclude. Their freedom was purchased with other people's deaths. What ended with the frigate, then, was not a utopia. It was a historical possibility, a demonstration that the ocean could be a space outside state control, that men could live there according to their own rules, that the structures of power that governed the land did not automatically extend to the water. The frigate closed that possibility. It demonstrated that the state could, if it chose, extend its power across any distance. It demonstrated that nowhere was truly beyond reach. It demonstrated that freedom from law was a temporary condition, contingent on the law's priorities, erasable when those priorities shifted. The pirates who survived the purge of the 1720s understood this. The men who escaped Robert's defeat, who slipped away from other captured vessels, who watched from shore as their friends hanged, these men did not, for the most part, return to piracy. They took pardons when offered. They settled into colonial communities, becoming fishermen and laborers and small traders, men with pasts they did not discuss. They married local women, raised children who never knew their fathers had once sailed under the black flag. They disappeared into the ordinary population, their brief seasons of freedom becoming family rumors, half-remembered stories. Eventually, nothing at all. A few refused assimilation. A few continued operating in diminished circumstances, taking small prizes in remote waters, always moving, always watching for the frigate that would end them. These men became less pirates than fugitives, their lives defined not by what they took, but by what pursued them. They grew old on the edges of empire, or died young in skirmishes that no one recorded. Their fates were various and mostly undocumented. The sources that preserve Roberts and Blackbeard for us did not bother with these marginal figures. They were not important enough to prosecute, not dangerous enough to warrant official attention, not successful enough to generate the legends that might have preserved them. They simply vanished, as most human lives vanish, leaving no trace. The few exceptions prove the rule. In the 1730s and 1740s, isolated pirates still made news. A sloop taken here, a crew captured there, an occasional hanging that drew crowds in port towns still populated by people who remembered the Great Age. But these events were anomalies, not patterns. They were survivals, like the dinosaurs that persisted for a few million years after the asteroid. The main event was over. The ecosystem that had sustained large-scale Atlantic piracy no longer existed. The ecosystem's collapse was material as much as military. The frigate was the visible agent of change, but it operated within a broader transformation that reshaped the entire Atlantic world. Colonial populations grew, port towns became cities, coastlines that had been wilderness became farmland, settled country, territory where strangers were noticed and reported. The network of intelligence that had been so poor in 1700, so full of gaps and delays and unreliable informants, became steadily more effective as communication improved and institutions thickened. A pirate ship that entered colonial waters in 1730 faced not just the frigate, but the entire apparatus of colonial society mobilized against it. Merchants offered rewards, governors coordinated responses, common sailors who had once been potential recruits became potential informants, knowing that cooperation with authorities might earn them favor, while cooperation with pirates would earn them the noose. The pirates had always depended on a degree of social tolerance, or at least indifference. Coastal communities that bought their goods, taverns that served their crews, women who took their money, merchants who laundered their prizes, all of these had been part of the pirate economy, and all of them became increasingly dangerous as enforcement intensified. The hanging of a pirate was a public event, staged for maximum visibility, designed to communicate to everyone who watched that this was the fate of those who traded with pirates, sheltered pirates, abetted pirates in any way. The message was received. The communities that had tacitly supported piracy began to withdraw that support. The information that pirates had once obtained easily, which ships were sailing when, what cargoes they carried, what routes they took, became harder to acquire. The social infrastructure of piracy collapsed alongside its military viability. What the frigate accomplished then was not merely the physical destruction of pirate vessels, it was the demonstration of imperial reach that made that broader social transformation possible. As long as pirates could operate with impunity, coastal communities had strong incentives to collaborate with them. The pirates were present, armed, and vindictive, while the authorities were distant and weak. Once frigates patrolled regularly, the calculus reversed. Now the authorities were present and the pirates were fugitives. Now cooperation with the state was the safe choice, and cooperation with pirates was the dangerous one. The frigate changed the incentive structure of the entire Atlantic world. This analysis may seem abstract, distant from the lived experience of the people it describes. So let us descend again to the material level, to the physical reality of what the frigate meant for the men who sailed on both sides of this conflict. Consider what it was like to be a pirate in the early 1730s, one of the survivors, a man who had lived through the Great Age and now found himself operating in its aftermath. You are, let us say, a man of 40. You went on the account in 1718, during the fever years when it seemed like everyone was doing it, when the prizes were fat and the authorities were overwhelmed. You served under a captain whose name is now forgotten, took ships in the Caribbean, spent your shares in Port Royal taverns, knew briefly the life that the pirates promised, freedom from hierarchy, wealth beyond what any sailor could legitimately earn, the fierce democracy of armed men choosing their own course. You survived the amnesty of 1718, took a pardon you never intended to honor, returned to the trade within the year. You survived the intensification of enforcement that followed, switching crews, staying mobile, watching friends hang. You survived Roberts's death, heard the news with something between satisfaction and fear. Satisfaction because Roberts had been competition, fear because what killed Roberts could kill you. Now it is 1731. You are operating a small sloop with 15 men, all of them aging, all of them wary. You have not taken a significant prize in 18 months. The ships you hunt are faster than they used to be, better armed, more likely to fight. The merchants have invested in defense. They have learned that resistance is safer than surrender, that pirates cannot afford casualties any more than their victims can. When you do take something, the cargo is often not worth the risk. Coasting traders carrying lumber and saltfish, nothing that will make you rich, nothing that justifies the life you are living. And always, always there is the frigate to consider. You have seen her twice in the past year, both times at a distance, both times fleeing. The first time you were lucky, the wind favored you, and your shallow draft let you slip into waters she could not follow. The second time was closer. You saw her topsails over the horizon, and you ran for 12 hours, throwing cargo overboard to lighten the ship, your crew working the sails with the desperation of men who know what capture means. She gave up eventually. She had other duties, could not chase every sloop indefinitely. But you know she is still out there, that she or her sisters patrol these waters now, that the old freedom is gone. Your crew is disintegrating. The young men who once sought berths on pirate vessels now seek berths on merchantmen or naval ships. The wages are lower, the conditions worse, but the future is longer. A man who serves 10 years in the Navy might emerge with a pension, with skills, with some possibility of a life on land. A man who spends 10 years as a pirate, if he survives that long, has nothing but the price on his head. The mathematics are clear, even to the illiterate. Your crew knows them. Every port you approach, 1 or 2 men slip away, disappear into the town's population, take whatever labor they can find. You cannot replace them. The pool of potential recruits has dried up. You think sometimes about taking the pardon. There is always another amnesty rumored, always some governor somewhere offering forgiveness to those who surrender. You could walk into a colonial courthouse, confess your crimes, promise reformation. Many have done it. Many have survived it. You might spend some years under scrutiny, watched by authorities who do not trust you, but you might eventually become a person again. A person with a name that does not appear on wanted lists. A person who can walk through a port town without scanning every face for recognition. But you do not quite trust it. You have seen men take pardons and be hanged anyway, their past crimes used against them when convenient. You have seen men who thought they were safe betrayed by old associates, by former victims, by the long memory of bureaucratic records. The pardon is a gamble, and you have spent your life gambling. You know how often gamblers lose, so you continue. You sail the margins, taking what you can, staying ahead of the frigate, watching your crew shrink and your options narrow. You do not dream anymore about wealth or freedom. You dream about survival, about making it through another season, about the possibility, increasingly remote, that you might somehow outlive the attention of the state. You are not a pirate anymore, not in the sense that Roberts was a pirate, not in the sense that made piracy a viable alternative to legitimate labor. You are a survivor, a holdover, a remnant. You are what the frigate left behind. This experience, multiplied across hundreds of men in various stages of similar decline, is the human reality of the frigate's triumph. The ship was a weapon, and like all weapons, it created suffering, not just in the moment of combat, but in the slow grind of lives compressed, possibilities foreclosed, futures erased. The pirates were not sympathetic figures, not most of them, not by any reasonable moral accounting. They killed, they tortured, they enslaved. Their victims were real people whose suffering was also real. The world that replaced the pirate world was in many ways a better world, safer for the ordinary sailors and merchants who had to cross the Atlantic. But the transition was not bloodless, and the blood was not all on one side. The Royal Navy, for its part, understood very well what it was doing and what tools it required to do it. The success of vessels like the Swallow generated a bureaucratic and strategic literature that shaped naval thinking for the rest of the 18th century. The frigate became not just a proven technology, but a symbol of a certain approach to maritime power, fast, flexible, persistent, capable of operating independently across vast distances. When the admirals and secretaries in London planned their response to future threats, they thought in terms of frigate deployment, frigate station keeping, frigate patrol routes. The implications extended beyond piracy. The same vessels that hunted Roberts would, in subsequent decades, hunt French privateers, Spanish commerce raiders, American revolutionaries. The skills developed in the pirate wars, long-range pursuit, independent command, the ability to operate for months without resupply, became the core competencies of British sea power. The officers who cut their teeth chasing pirates through Caribbean waters would later become the admirals who fought the great fleet actions of the mid-century wars. The institutional knowledge accumulated in a decade of pirate hunting would shape the Royal Navy for generations. In this sense, the pirates contributed not just to their own destruction, but to the creation of the force that would dominate the world's oceans for the next 2 centuries. They were the training exercise, the proving ground, the sparring partner against which the Royal Navy developed its form. Without the pirate threat, the Navy might have evolved differently, might have remained focused on the great ships of the line, the floating fortresses designed for fleet combat, rather than developing the flexible, far-ranging capabilities that frigates represented. The pirates forced an innovation, and the innovation outlasted them. The frigate that emerged from this period was not the same vessel that entered it. The ships that hunted pirates in the 1720s were themselves improved based on the lessons learned, their designs refined, their tactics codified. By 1740, the Royal Navy operated a standardized class of sixth-rate frigates that incorporated everything the pirate wars had taught. These vessels were faster, more weatherly, more reliable than their predecessors. They carried more sophisticated navigation instruments, better charts of pirate waters, accumulated intelligence about likely lurking spots and escape routes. They were crewed by men who had been trained in pirate hunting, who understood the specific challenges of the work, who had developed the patience and aggression the mission required. The knowledge transfer was not entirely one-directional. The pirates, in their brief flourishing, had contributed innovations of their own. Their preference for fore and aft rigging, their modifications for speed and maneuverability, their willingness to sacrifice cargo capacity for sailing performance, all of these influenced the development of fast-sailing vessels throughout the 18th century. The pirate sloop, stripped of its criminal associations, became the model for dispatch boats, pilot vessels, and light patrol craft. The lines that made a ship suitable for piracy also made it suitable for legitimate purposes that valued speed over capacity. In this way, too, the pirates left a legacy that outlasted them. But these technical contributions were incidental. What mattered, what shaped the subsequent history of maritime power, was the demonstration that the sea could be controlled. Before the frigate, oceanic commerce was a calculated risk, profitable enough to justify the danger, but never entirely safe. After the frigate, oceanic commerce became reliable, predictable, insurable in the modern sense. The Lloyds of London that emerged in the 18th century, the great insurance market that underwrote global trade, was only possible because the frigate had made that trade systematically safe. The premium calculations that determined what it cost to ship goods across the Atlantic were lower after 1730 than before. Lower because the frigate patrols had reduced the risk of pirate attack to a statistical negligibility. The merchants who benefited from this change did not, for the most part, think about it consciously. They did not wake each morning grateful for the HMS Swallow and her sisters. They simply conducted their business in a world where the frigate's presence was assumed, where the safety of the sea lanes was a background condition rather than a daily concern. This is what successful institutions accomplish. They become invisible, taken for granted, noticed only in their absence. The Navy that killed Bartholomew Roberts faded into the background of commercial life, its work so effective that people forgot it needed doing. But forgetting is not the same as irrelevance. The work continued even as consciousness of it faded. And that work, by the late 1720s, had entered its final phase, not the hunting of individual pirates, but the systematic erasure of the conditions that had allowed piracy to exist at all. To understand this phase, we must return to the question of geography, to the physical spaces where pirates had made their homes. Because the frigate, for all its speed and firepower, was only one half of an equation. The other half was land, the harbors, the coves, the uncharted islands where pirates had sheltered, repaired, and waited for prey. The frigate could hunt pirates at sea, could intercept them in transit, could chase them down over distances that had once been uncrossable. But as long as pirates retained secure bases on land, as long as they could disappear into a maze of islands and shoals that the Navy did not fully know, they could always return. The solution required not just sea power but territorial control, not just hunting but settlement, not just frigates but forts, governors, garrisons, and the slow extension of administrative reach into every corner of the Caribbean. This was Woodes Rogers' real contribution. Not the individual pirate captures, impressive as they were, but the demonstration that Nassau could be transformed, that a pirate stronghold could be converted into a functioning colonial possession through a combination of force, amnesty, and institutional development. When Rogers arrived at New Providence in 1718, Nassau was a town of approximately 1,000 people, most of them pirates or people who lived by servicing pirates. There was no court, no jail, no functioning government of any kind. The harbor was full of pirate vessels, the streets full of armed men who recognized no authority beyond their own captains. Rogers had with him approximately 500 soldiers and settlers, a small force to impose order on such a population. What he did not have was time. His commission from the Crown was expensive to maintain, his funds limited, his support from London uncertain. He knew that the pirates who accepted his pardon might return to their trade the moment his back was turned. He knew that the pirates who refused his pardon, the hardcore who sailed away rather than submit, would attempt to retake the island the moment they sensed weakness. He was, in essence, trying to hold a position that the enemy knew better than he did, with inferior numbers, inadequate supplies, and no guarantee of reinforcement. The first months were precarious. Rogers established a rudimentary government, appointed officials, began the construction of fortifications. He tried to convert former pirates into legitimate citizens, offering them land grants, encouraging them to take up fishing or salvage work or any occupation that did not require robbing ships. Some accepted. Many did not. The ones who did not disappeared into the Bahamas' 1,200 islands and cays, waiting. Charles Vane was among those who refused the pardon. When Rogers' ships entered Nassau Harbor in July 1718, Vane responded by setting a French prize ship ablaze and sailing it directly at the approaching fleet, a fireship attack that forced Rogers' squadron to scatter while Vane escaped into the night. It was an act of pure defiance, a gesture that announced Vane's intention to continue his trade, regardless of what the Crown proclaimed. Over the following months, Vane raided throughout the Caribbean, capturing vessels within sight of the very islands Rogers was trying to pacify. The message was clear. The pardon meant nothing if it could not be enforced. The forts and courts and officials Rogers was building in Nassau were theater, unless backed by the ability to reach out and destroy those who defied them. This is where the frigate became essential, not just as a hunting platform, but as the instrument that extended Rogers' reach beyond the harbor, beyond the visible horizon, into the labyrinthine waters where Vane and his fellow refusers lurked. The pursuit of Charles Vane illustrates the operational challenges the Navy faced. Vane knew the Bahamas intimately, knew which channels were deep enough for his sloop, which shoals would trap a deeper drafted pursuer. He knew the islands where he could find fresh water, where he could careen his ship, where he could wait in ambush for unwary merchantmen. The Navy knew far less. Charts of the Bahamas were incomplete, often inaccurate, sometimes deliberately falsified by local pilots who had their own reasons for keeping the waters mysterious. A captain, pursuing Vane, might find himself grounded on a reef that appeared on no chart, stranded in shallow water while his quarry sailed merrily away. The solution was institutional rather than individual. Over the years following Rogers' arrival, the Navy systematically mapped the Bahamas, surveying channels, marking shoals, creating the charts that would allow future hunters to operate with confidence. Frigates patrolling the islands reported their observations, compiled data, contributed to a collective knowledge that no individual captain could have accumulated. Local pilots were recruited, sometimes coerced into service, men who knew the waters because they had sailed them as pirates or as the merchants the pirates had preyed upon. The accumulated intelligence was shared, codified, preserved. This process was slow. It could not catch Vane immediately, could not prevent him from taking prizes throughout 1718 and into 1719. But it steadily reduced the space in which Vane could operate. Each voyage that ended without his capture nonetheless produced information. Sightings reported, courses tracked, patterns discerned. The Navy learned that Vane favored certain anchorages, that he traded with certain disreputable merchants, that he tended to hunt in certain sea lanes. The knowledge accumulated, and as it accumulated, the noose tightened. Vane's end came not from a frigate, but from the sea itself. In February 1719, a hurricane caught his ship in the Bay of Honduras and drove it onto a reef. Most of the crew drowned. Vane survived, was marooned on a small island for months, was eventually recognized by a passing ship's captain who had once been robbed by him. He was taken to Jamaica, tried, and hanged in March 1721. The storm did what the Navy had not yet managed to do. But the storm was, in a sense, a product of the same pressures the Navy applied. Vane had been driven to the Bay of Honduras because safer waters had become too dangerous. The Caribbean proper, the shipping lanes Rogers was trying to protect, had become increasingly hazardous for pirates as frigate patrols intensified. Pirates who wanted to continue their trade were pushed to the margins, the Bay of Honduras, the coasts of Africa, the remote reaches of the Indian Ocean. These margins were more dangerous, more distant from supply and repair, more subject to the weather systems that govern tropical waters. The Navy did not need to catch every pirate. It needed to make piracy so difficult that pirates destroyed themselves through the desperate measures they were forced to adopt. This was the strategic logic that governed the final campaign against Bartholomew Roberts. By 1720, Roberts had largely abandoned the Caribbean, recognizing that the concentration of naval force there made profitable hunting too risky. His shift to African waters was a retreat dressed as expansion, a recognition that the old hunting grounds had become untenable. The Navy's response was to follow him there, to extend the same pressure to Africa that had driven him from the Americas. The HMS Swallow and HMS Weymouth were not sent to Africa solely to hunt Roberts. They were part of a broader effort to establish naval presence along the slave coast, to protect the growing trade in human beings that had become central to the Atlantic economy. Roberts was a threat to that trade. Yes, his captures of slave ships disrupted commerce and drove up insurance rates. But the strategic purpose of the African squadron went beyond any individual pirate. The goal was to demonstrate that British naval power could reach anywhere, that no corner of the Atlantic was beyond its grasp. Captain Challoner Ogle understood this context when he received his orders. He was not simply hunting a pirate. He was extending the system that had pacified the Caribbean to new waters, applying lessons learned in the Bahamas to the very different conditions of the African coast. The challenges were distinct. African waters lacked the network of British ports and settlements that supported Caribbean operations. Resupply was more difficult, information scarcer, local populations less cooperative. The coast itself was dangerous, malarial, subject to violent seasonal shifts in wind and current, poorly charted in many sections. But Ogle had advantages Roberts lacked. His frigates were purpose-built for this work, designed and refined through decades of anti-piracy operations. His crews were trained, disciplined, capable of operating for extended periods without the shore leave that pirates required. His ships carried the best available charts of African waters, compiled from merchant reports and earlier naval voyages, and he had time on his side. The Navy could afford to be patient, pirates could not. The hunt for Roberts lasted months before the final confrontation at Cape Lopez. During those months, Ogle worked methodically, patrolling likely hunting grounds, intercepting vessels that might have information, building a picture of Roberts's movements. He learned that Roberts commanded multiple ships, that his fleet was larger than any single frigate could engage, that direct confrontation would be risky unless conditions favored the Navy. So he maneuvered for those conditions, waiting for the moment when Roberts would be caught at disadvantage. The opportunity came in early February 1722. Roberts was anchored at Cape Lopez with 3 ships, his flagship Royal Fortune, a consort vessel, and a recently captured prize. The fleet was careening, scraping accumulated growth from hulls to restore lost speed. Careening required ships to be heeled over, their guns dismounted, their crews divided between the work and the shore camp. A fleet caught careening was a fleet caught helpless. Ogle approached carefully. He knew that Roberts posted lookouts, that pirate vigilance was legendary. That surprise was unlikely to be complete. What he needed was not surprise but advantage, the ability to engage before Roberts's ships could restore themselves to fighting trim. The morning of February 10th provided that opportunity. The first ship Ogle encountered was the Ranger, commanded by one of Roberts's lieutenants. The Ranger was afloat and partially armed. She had finished careening before the others, but her crew was depleted, many men still ashore or aboard the other vessels. What followed was not a battle but a demonstration. The Swallow ran down on the Ranger with everything she had, her gun crews poised, her Marines ready at the rails. The Ranger's crew, seeing what was coming, attempted to flee toward the shore. They did not make it. The Swallow cut them off, positioned herself to windward, opened fire at close range. The Ranger's return fire was ragged, uncoordinated, too few men at the guns, too little time to prepare. Within 30 minutes, the Ranger was disabled, her masts damaged, her crew surrendering. Ogle took the survivors prisoner and turned back toward Cape Lopez. Roberts knew the Swallow was coming. The sound of the engagement with the Ranger had carried across the water, and Roberts's lookouts had tracked the smoke. By the time Ogle reappeared, the Royal Fortune was attempting to flee, sails set, anchor raised, guns run out. But the Royal Fortune was not ready. Her hull still bore the drag of weeks without cleaning. Her crew had been drinking. It was the morning after a successful capture, and discipline had slackened. Many of her best men were prisoners aboard the Swallow or dead in the water around the Ranger's wreck. The chase that followed was brief by the standards of naval pursuit. The Swallow was faster, her crew fresh, her captain experienced in exactly this kind of running fight. Roberts did what pirates always did when caught. He tried to run until running became impossible, then turned to fight. The turn came approximately 2 hours into the chase, when it became clear that the Swallow was gaining too fast to outrun. Roberts dressed for the occasion. He put on his finest clothes, a red damask waistcoat, a scarlet coat, a hat with a feather. He wore his cutlass at his side and pistols on a silk sling across his shoulder. Whatever else he was, whatever crimes he had committed, he understood the importance of performance. If he was going to die, he intended to die as the figure he had constructed, the pirate prince, the scourge of the Atlantic, the man who had taken more ships than any other in history. The Swallow opened fire first, a broadside at extreme range intended to test the pirates' response. Roberts responded by bringing the Royal Fortune around to engage directly, presenting his own broadside and ordering his gunners to fire. The exchange that followed lasted approximately an hour, the two ships circling each other at pistol shot, hammering broadsides into each other's hulls. Roberts died in the opening exchange. A grape shot burst. A cloud of small iron balls designed to sweep decks of men struck him in the throat. He was dead before he hit the deck, killed by the same kind of weapon he had used to clear the decks of his own prizes. His crew, seeing him fall, did what crews without leaders do. They wavered. Some kept fighting, driven by desperation or stupidity or the knowledge that capture meant hanging. Others retreated below, seeking shelter from the iron storm that continued to sweep the deck. The Royal Fortune surrendered within 90 minutes of the engagement's start. The Swallow's Marines boarded her and found Roberts's body lying where it had fallen, his finery soaked with blood, his pistols unfired. His crew had thrown his body overboard before the Marines could take it. They knew the Navy wanted to display it, to hang his corpse in chains as a warning, and even in defeat, they would not give the authorities that satisfaction. The trial that followed was the largest pirate trial in history. 264 men faced charges. Of these, 74 were sentenced to death and 52 were actually hanged, the largest mass execution of pirates ever conducted by British colonial authorities. The rest were sentenced to various terms of servitude, imprisonment, or hard labor. The Royal African Company recovered what could be recovered of its stolen goods. The insurance markets noted the reduction in risk, and the Atlantic, quite suddenly, fell quiet. The speed of the transformation startled even those who had worked to bring it about. In 1718, the sea had seemed lawless, ungovernable, a place where any man with a fast ship and a brutal crew could make himself a king. By 1726, piracy in the Atlantic was effectively finished. Individual pirates would continue to operate here and there, opportunistic raiders who attacked isolated vessels and fled before the Navy could respond. But the era of pirate fleets, of Roberts's squadrons and Blackbeard's armadas, was over. The frigate had hunted them into extinction. The mechanism of that extinction deserves more attention than it usually receives. It was not simply that frigates were faster or better armed than pirate vessels, though both things were true. It was that the frigate represented a way of organizing maritime violence that pirates could not match. The frigate was part of a system, a network of ports and supply lines, intelligence gathering and information sharing, standardized training and established doctrine. Pirates were individuals, or at most small groups of individuals, operating without institutional support. In the short term, this gave pirates advantages. They were more flexible, more willing to take risks, unburdened by the bureaucratic constraints that slowed naval decision-making. A pirate captain could decide to attack a ship in the time it would take a naval officer to write a report requesting permission. But in the long term, the system always wins. The system accumulates knowledge. The The system repairs its losses, the system learns from its mistakes, and applies those lessons across all its components. The individual, no matter how talented, how aggressive, how lucky, eventually runs out of luck while the system keeps coming. Roberts was perhaps the most capable pirate who ever lived. His tactical instincts, his ability to command loyalty, his understanding of when to fight and when to flee, all of these were exceptional. And none of them mattered in the end because he was one man commanding at most a few hundred others, while Challoner Ogle was one officer in a navy of thousands, backed by an empire whose resources dwarfed anything a pirate could accumulate. When Roberts made a mistake, when he lingered too long at Cape Lopez or allowed his crew to drink too heavily, he paid for it with his life and the destruction of everything he had built. When the Navy made mistakes, and it made many throughout the long campaign against piracy, it absorbed the lesson and sent more ships. This asymmetry was the frigate's true advantage, not speed alone, not firepower alone, but the relentless institutional pressure that a ship class could apply while individual vessels came and went. The frigates that hunted pirates in the 1720s were themselves replaced by improved designs in the 1730s, which were replaced again in the 1740s, each generation incorporating the lessons of the last. The pirates had no such continuity. When Roberts died, his knowledge died with him. When the Swallow returned to port, her logs and reports entered an archive that would inform naval operations for decades. The world that emerged from this asymmetric contest was, in certain respects, the one we still inhabit. The assumption that the seas can be policed, that commerce can move in safety across oceanic distances, that states rather than private actors control maritime violence. These assumptions became so fundamental to the international order that we no longer recognize them as assumptions at all. They seem natural, inevitable, the way things have always been. But they were made. They were made in the waters off Cape Lopez and Nassau Harbor and 100 other places where frigates ran down pirates and forced them to choose between surrender and death. The men who commanded those frigates understood, with varying degrees of clarity, that they were building something. Woodes Rogers, the former privateer turned pirate hunter, grasped it perhaps better than anyone. He had been on both sides of the line. He knew what pirates wanted, what they feared, what motivated their choices. And he understood that defeating piracy required more than simply killing pirates. It required destroying the conditions that made piracy possible. Rogers arrived in Nassau Harbor in July 1718 with a small squadron and a royal commission as governor of the Bahamas. The islands had been, for nearly a decade, the heart of Atlantic piracy, a place where several hundred pirates made their base, where stolen goods could be fenced and ships careened, where any man with a cutlass and a willingness to use it could find a berth. The legitimate population had long since fled or accommodated themselves to pirate rule. Nassau was, for all practical purposes, a pirate republic. Rogers brought with him not just ships, but an offer: the king's pardon for any pirate who surrendered within a specified period and agreed to abandon the trade forever. This was the carrot. The stick was the frigates anchored in the harbor, their gun ports open, their crews at quarters. The calculation was shrewd. Rogers understood that most pirates were not committed ideologues of maritime anarchy. They were men who had drifted into crime through circumstance, sailors pressed into naval service and brutalized by their officers, merchant seamen underpaid and overworked, men who saw piracy as a rational response to conditions that offered them few alternatives. Given a genuine opportunity to return to lawful life without punishment, many would take it, and many did. In the weeks following Rogers' arrival, somewhere between 300 and 400 pirates accepted the pardon. They lined up on the beach, signed their names or made their marks on the register, and walked away from the only prosperity most of them had ever known. It was not idealism that moved them. It was the recognition that the frigate in the harbor represented a future in which piracy could not survive. Better to surrender now, while surrender was still an option, than to die later on some distant shore with a naval broadside tearing through the hull. But not everyone accepted the offer. A hard core of pirates, perhaps 100, perhaps more, refused the pardon and fled Nassau before Rogers could consolidate his control. Among them was Charles Vane, one of the most notorious captains of the era, a man whose brutality had earned him a reputation even among pirates. Vane sailed directly past Rogers' flagship on his way out of the harbor, firing a defiant broadside as he went. It was theater as much as tactics, a declaration that not every pirate would go quietly into the night of extinction. What followed was the template for how the frigate age would unfold. Rogers dispatched ships to pursue Vane. The pursuit failed initially. Vane was clever, his ship was fast, and the Caribbean offered endless places to hide. But the pursuit never stopped. Month after month, ship after ship, the Navy followed Vane across the Atlantic, from the Carolinas to Honduras to the Bay Islands. He could not settle anywhere. He could not careen his vessel without fear of discovery. He could not recruit new crew, because word had spread that accepting the pardon was safer than joining a hunted man. In the end, nature accomplished what the frigates could not quite manage. A hurricane dismasted Vane's ship and cast him onto a small island, where he survived for months as a castaway before being recognized by a passing captain and delivered to Jamaica in chains. He was tried, convicted, and hanged in March 1721. But the point was not Vane's death. The point was the months that preceded it, the slow strangulation of his options, the constant pressure that prevented him from operating effectively, the transformation of a feared pirate captain into a desperate fugitive. The frigates did not need to catch him. They needed only to deny him the space in which piracy could function. Eventually, one way or another, the sea would finish what they started. This pattern repeated itself across the Caribbean and along the African coast. Blackbeard, the most famous pirate of the era, died in November 1718, just months after Rogers' arrival in Nassau, when Lieutenant Robert Maynard cornered him in a small inlet off North Carolina. The battle itself was chaotic, fought largely with pistols and cutlasses in close quarters on Blackbeard's own deck. But the engagement was only possible because the Navy had spent months gathering intelligence, tracking Blackbeard's movements, positioning vessels to cut off his escape routes. When Maynard found him, Blackbeard had nowhere left to run. Stede Bonnet, the gentleman pirate whose amateurish career had made him a figure of mockery among his own kind, was captured that same year and hanged in Charleston. Samuel Bellamy had already drowned in the wreck of the Whydah off Cape Cod, his ship caught in a storm that the Navy could not have predicted but was perfectly willing to exploit. One by one, the great names of the pirate Golden Age were erased from the sea. And with each erasure, the calculus shifted for those who remained. Every hanging was a demonstration. Every head displayed on a pike at a harbor entrance was an argument. The message was simple. This ends. This ends now, or this ends later. But this ends. The only choice you have is how. By 1720, the pirates who remained were increasingly desperate. They attacked ships they should have avoided, took risks they would once have scorned, sailed into waters where frigates were known to patrol because safer waters no longer existed. The psychological dimension of the frigate's dominance was as important as the physical. These were men who had built their identities around freedom. Freedom from authority, freedom from hierarchy, freedom from the thousand constraints that bound ordinary sailors to their brutal conditions. And the frigate stripped that freedom away, not by capturing them, but by demonstrating that they were not free at all, that they existed only in the shrinking spaces where the Navy had not yet chosen to look. The final phase of the campaign was almost anticlimactic. Roberts was the last of the great captains, the last man commanding a force large enough to meaningfully resist. When Ogle's squadron found him at Cape Lopez, Roberts controlled 4 ships and roughly 500 men, a substantial fleet by pirate standards, but trivial compared to the naval forces that could be brought against him if he stood and fought. His strategic position was already hopeless before the first cannon fired. The battle merely formalized what the preceding decade had made inevitable. What remained after Cape Lopez were ghosts and stragglers, men like Edward Lowe, whose sadistic cruelty had earned him enemies even among pirates, continued to operate for a few more years before vanishing from the historical record, killed perhaps by his own crew or hanged by some colonial authority whose records have been lost. Men like John Gow, who led a brief mutiny in 1724 and was captured within months. Men whose names we do not know, who attacked a ship or two before being run down by the frigates that now patrolled every major shipping lane. The infrastructure of piracy collapsed along with its practitioners. The fences who had bought stolen goods found other, less dangerous investments. The port officials who had turned blind eyes found it healthier to see clearly. The colonial governors who had quietly tolerated pirate presence discovered a sudden enthusiasm for law enforcement. The system had won, and everyone with sense was eager to be seen on the winning side. This brings us to a question that the tactical histories rarely ask. What was lost? The romantic answer is obvious: freedom, adventure, the dream of a life outside the crushing hierarchies of 18th century society. The pirate, in legend, represents something that most people cannot articulate but feel deeply: a rejection of the world as given, a refusal to accept that the structures of power are natural or inevitable. When the frigate hunted the pirate into extinction, something in the human imagination was diminished, some possibility was closed off forever. This is not entirely wrong. The pirates of the Golden Age were many things, but they were not simply criminals. They were also experimenters in alternative social organization. Their ships, for all their brutality, operated on democratic principles that the supposedly civilized world would not embrace for another century. Captains were elected and could be deposed. Plunder was distributed according to written rules, shares allocated by rank but with a rough equality that bore no resemblance to the stratification of naval or merchant vessels. Injured pirates received disability compensation. Disputes were settled by vote. This was not utopia. The freedom of the pirate ship was built on the suffering of their victims. The democracy of the quarterdeck coexisted with murder, rape, and torture. The equality among the crew was possible only because inequality was exported. The slaves in the holds of captured ships, the merchant sailors forced to choose between joining the pirates or being abandoned on some desolate shore. Every pirate republic was funded by the blood trade in human beings, but the frigate did not end piracy because of these moral failings. The frigate ended piracy because piracy was economically inconvenient to powerful interests, and those interests had finally decided to deploy the force necessary to eliminate the inconvenience. The same empire that sent frigates against pirates was simultaneously running the slave trade on an industrial scale, extracting wealth from colonies through systems of coerced labor, impressing its own citizens into naval service under conditions that differed from slavery primarily in the vocabulary used to describe them. This is not a defense of piracy. It is a recognition that the contest between the pirate and the frigate was not a contest between evil and good, but a contest between two different forms of violence, one organized and one chaotic, one imperial and one individual, one that built institutions and one that tore them down. The frigate won not because it was more moral, but because it was more powerful, more systematic, more patient. And the world the frigate built is the one we inherited. The assumption that the state monopolizes legitimate violence at sea. The assumption that commerce moves under the protection of naval power. The assumption that the ocean is not a wilderness, but a governed space, subject to laws and patrols and the settled expectations of international order. These are the fruits of the frigate's victory. Whether those fruits were sweet or bitter depends entirely on who you ask. The merchants of London and Bristol and the plantation owners of Jamaica and Barbados certainly thought them sweet. The insurance underwriters of Lloyd's Coffee House, who could now calculate maritime risk with some confidence that their calculations would hold, thought them sweet. The naval officers who built careers in the suppression of piracy, who rose through the ranks in the decades that followed, thought them very sweet indeed. The sailors pressed into service on those same frigates, beaten and starved and worked to exhaustion for wages that were half what a pirate could promise, might have answered differently. The African captives in the holds of the slave ships that now moved unmolested across the Atlantic might have answered differently, if anyone had thought to ask them. The answer depends on where you stand. and most of the people who stood in places that mattered have left records that support the view that the pirates' extinction was progress. The frigate itself continued to evolve after the pirates were gone. The ship class that had been developed partly in response to piracy found new missions as the 18th century progressed. Frigates fought in the 7 Years' War, harrying French commerce and protecting British convoys. They fought in the American Revolution, where their speed and versatility made them ideal for the fluid operations of coastal warfare. They fought in the Napoleonic Wars, where captains like Thomas Cochrane used them with such brilliance that even the enemy's own accounts read like adventure novels. But the fundamental logic of the frigate remained constant across all these conflicts. The medium warship, fast enough to chase and powerful enough to kill, patrolling the shipping lanes and denying the sea to those who would use it without permission. The enforcer of order on an inherently disordered element, the physical manifestation of the proposition that the ocean too could be governed. The last of the true pirates, the men who remembered the Golden Age, who had sailed with Roberts or Blackbeard or Vane, were dead by 1730 or thereabouts. Some on the gallows, some in prison, some in obscure corners of the colonial world where they had hidden themselves under assumed names and lived out their years in quiet terror that someone would remember. The sea they had known, the wild sea of the early century, had been tamed. The frigate had domesticated it. What happened next, the long history of maritime enforcement, of anti-slavery patrols and colonial policing, and the global projection of naval power, flows directly from the pirate wars of the 1710s and 1720s. The lesson learned in those waters was that the ocean could be controlled, that sufficient investment in the right kind of warship could eliminate threats that had once seemed permanent features of maritime life. It was a lesson that would be applied again and again across centuries and continents as the naval powers of the West extended their reach into every corner of the world's waters. And still, something persists. Not the reality of piracy, which survives only in marginal forms in unstable regions, but the idea of piracy, the romance of it, the black flag and the cutlass and the wild freedom of men who answered to no authority but their own. The pirate endures in imagination long after the frigate erased him from history, and the endurance tells us something about what we are, about what we desire, about the parts of ourselves that civilization has suppressed but not eliminated. Every generation reinvents the pirate for its own purposes. The 19th century gave us the swashbuckler, the gentleman adventurer with a moral code. The 20th century gave us the rebel, the counterculture figure who prefigured later forms of resistance. The 21st century gives us the digital pirate, the hacker who claims the mantle without the cutlass, the vision of freedom transferred from the ocean to the network. But the frigate is always there, just over the horizon, the mechanism of order that follows wherever disorder flourishes, the system that learns, that accumulates, that never tires and never forgets. The state's instrument, built to patrol the boundaries of the permissible and destroy whatever crosses them. This is what the pirate wars of the early 18th century established, and what we live with still. The ocean as a governed space, the state as the arbiter of maritime violence, the ship of war as the physical guarantee that these propositions hold. The frigate made this world. The pirates, by their extinction, proved that no alternative was possible. And yet, the sea does not remember the men who sailed it. The waves that carried Roberts and Blackbeard and Vane carry container ships now, cargo vessels stacked high with goods moving under the protection of naval patrols that can trace their lineage directly to Challoner Ogle's squadron. The blood that colored the water off Cape Lopez has long since dispersed, molecule by molecule, into the vast indifference of the Atlantic. The battles are over, the hunters and the hunted alike reduced to the same silence. But in the archives of London and Bristol, in the trial transcripts and the naval logs and the letters of colonial governors, the story survives. Not the whole story, never the whole story, but enough to glimpse what was lost and what was gained when the frigate hunted the pirate into extinction. Enough to understand that the world we inhabit was not inevitable, that it was made by specific ships and specific men in specific moments that could have gone differently. Enough to ask whether the makers knew what they were making. They did not know. That is the answer, or the closest thing to an answer that the evidence permits. Challoner Ogle, sailing back to England with his hold full of pirate treasure and his reputation secure, understood that he had won a battle and captured a fortune. He did not understand that he had helped end an era. The lords of the Admiralty, signing requisitions for more fifth rates and sixth rates to patrol the colonial waters, understood that they were investing in maritime security. They did not understand that they were building the infrastructure of global empire. Woodes Rogers, dying in Nassau in 1732, his health broken by tropical fevers and his finances in perpetual disorder, understood that he had pacified a pirate haven. He did not understand that he had established a template that would be applied to every ungoverned space the empire encountered for the next 2 centuries. This is how history happens, not through grand visions executed by knowing architects, but through practical men solving immediate problems and accidentally constructing the future. The frigate was not designed to make the world we live in. It was designed to catch pirates. That it did both is the kind of irony that history specializes in producing and participants rarely recognize. The last great set piece of the pirate wars, the final chase sequence before the curtain falls, occurred not at Cape Lopez, but in the months immediately following it. Because Ogle's victory, decisive as it was, did not end piracy overnight. It broke its back, scattered its survivors, demonstrated its futility. But scattered survivors still needed to be hunted. And in that hunting, the frigate's capabilities received their final proof. Consider what happened to the remnants of Roberts's Confederation. At Cape Lopez, 169 men had been captured. 52 were hanged at Cape Coast Castle in the largest mass execution of pirates in history. But the rest, the crew members judged to have been forced men, the musicians and surgeons and cooks who could claim compulsion, were released or transported. And they were not the only men who had sailed under black flags and managed to evade the noose. Up and down the African coast, in the Caribbean basin, in the scattered inlets of the American seaboard, there remained hundreds of men who had been pirates and might become pirates again if conditions permitted. Conditions did not permit. What the naval records of 1722 and 1723 show is a systematic effort to ensure that the Roberts defeat was not an isolated victory, but the beginning of permanent suppression. The Swallow and the Weymouth, after their triumph, did not return immediately to England. They cruised, they patrolled, they showed the flag at every port and landing where pirates had ever found welcome, and at each stop the message was the same. The game is over. The men who might once have crewed a pirate vessel watched those frigates sail past and understood, in whatever calculating center of their souls governed risk assessment, that the odds had shifted irrevocably against them. The logistics of this patrol work are worth examining, because they reveal the true nature of the frigate's advantage. A fifth rate could stay at sea for months. Her provisions could be replenished at any port controlled by the Crown. Her crew could be replaced by impressment if casualties depleted the roster. Her sails and rigging could be repaired by skilled specialists working from standardized plans. When she sailed into a harbor, every merchant, every planter, every colonial official knew that she could return tomorrow or next week or next month, at times and intervals they could not predict. The pirate vessel, dependent on what it could steal and unable to enter protected ports, had no such capacity for sustained presence. It could threaten a coast for weeks, perhaps months. Then it had to move on, to find new hunting grounds, to stay ahead of the reports that traveled faster than any ship. The frigate did not have to move on. The frigate could stay. This is the asymmetry that destroyed piracy. Not superior firepower in any single engagement, though that mattered, but superior persistence. The ability to occupy a space rather than merely pass through it. The capacity to make the ocean feel patrolled, governed, supervised in ways it had never been before. By 1724, when the last desperate echoes of the Roberts Confederation had been suppressed, and the men who might have rebuilt it had either died or dispersed or quietly returned to legitimate maritime labor, the Caribbean and the Atlantic trade routes had become something they had never previously been. Safe. Not perfectly safe, storms still sank ships, and pirates would continue to exist in diminished form for decades, but safe enough. Safe enough to satisfy the insurers at Lloyd's, safe enough to justify the enormous investments that the plantation economy required, safe enough to transform the Atlantic from a space of endemic danger into something closer to a governed sea. The men who made this transformation possible did not live to see its full consequences. Ogle died in 1750, an admiral and a baronet, wealthy from his share of the prize money and secure in his reputation as the man who had killed the greatest pirate of his age. He is buried in England, in a church whose location I will not reveal, because it does not matter. What matters is that he died thinking he had accomplished something specific and limited, the defeat of a pirate fleet. He had accomplished something far larger, and he never knew. The same ignorance attended all the others. The shipwrights who refined the frigate's design through incremental experiments in hull shape and sail plan. The administrators who developed the system of colonial naval stations that allowed these ships to operate thousands of miles from home. The officers who accumulated tactical knowledge through dozens of engagements and passed it down through instruction and example. The investors who funded the colonial trades that made the whole enterprise profitable. Not one of them saw the complete picture. Not one of them understood that they were collaborating on the creation of a new world system in which oceanic space would be as subject to state authority as dry land. And yet they made it anyway. That is the lesson, if there is one. That history is made by participants who cannot see what they are making. There is a document in the National Archives at Kew, Admiralty Records, Series 1, that illuminates this blindness with particular clarity. It is a report from a colonial governor written in 1726, summarizing the state of maritime security in his jurisdiction. He notes with satisfaction that no pirate attacks have been recorded in over 2 years. He credits this to the diligent cruising of His Majesty's ships of war and requests additional frigates to ensure the gains are not reversed. He estimates the economic benefits of suppressed piracy. Increased shipping volume, reduced insurance rates, greater investment in plantation development. He calculates the return on naval expenditure and finds it favorable. Nowhere in this report does the governor suggest that anything fundamental has changed. The pirates, in his telling, are simply criminals who have been temporarily suppressed and might return if vigilance lapses. He does not understand that the suppression is permanent, that the conditions which made piracy possible, the ungoverned ocean, the asymmetry between naval presence and maritime commerce, have been definitively altered. He thinks he is managing a problem. He's actually witnessing a transformation. This is how we must understand the frigate's achievement, not as a technological solution to a military problem, though it was that. Not as an instrument of imperial expansion, though it was that too. But as a boundary marker, a pivot point, the moment when the ocean ceased to be wild and became, with whatever qualifications and whatever exceptions, tame. The pirates who died at Cape Lopez and Cape Coast Castle and the scattered execution docks of the colonial world were not simply criminals punished for their crimes. They were the last representatives of a way of life that the frigate rendered impossible. After them, the sea belonged to states. There is melancholy in this, though we must be careful not to let melancholy distort our understanding. The pirates were not heroes. They were not freedom fighters or proto-revolutionaries or anything else that would make their defeat a tragedy. They were, in the main, violent men engaged in violent work for personal profit, and the world is not obviously worse for their extinction. The trade they preyed upon, particularly the slave trade, which accounted for so much of the shipping that attracted their attention, was monstrous, and the pirates' interference with it was purely incidental, a byproduct of their self-interest rather than any form of resistance. We cannot mourn them without distortion. And yet something was lost when they disappeared, some human capacity that the frigate's victory suppressed. Call it wildness or autonomy, or the ability to imagine a life outside institutional structures. The pirates, for all their brutality, represented a possibility that the frigate foreclosed, the possibility that the ocean might remain a space where individuals could operate beyond the reach of states. That possibility died at Cape Lopez, and nothing that has happened since has restored it. The question that remains, the question that haunts these waters still, is whether that foreclosure was inevitable, whether the concentration of naval power that destroyed the pirates was a necessary feature of maritime history, or whether some other arrangement might have been possible. The evidence suggests inevitability. The economics of maritime trade demanded security. The security demanded naval presence. The naval presence demanded ships capable of sustained ocean patrol. And those ships, once built, could be used for purposes beyond pirate suppression, were used, to project state power into every corner of the globe, to enforce the boundaries of empire, to guarantee the extraction of wealth from colonized regions. The pirate wars were prelude to something larger, and what they foreshadowed has been the dominant feature of maritime history for the past 300 years. Consider what the frigate became after the pirates were gone. The same class of ship that hunted Bartholomew Roberts patrolled the West African coast in the 19th century, suppressing the slave trade that it had once protected. The same design principles that made the fifth rate effective against pirate sloops were scaled up and refined into the ships of the line that established British naval dominance at Trafalgar. The same system of colonial naval stations that allowed Ogle to operate off the African coast was extended and elaborated until the Royal Navy could reach any point on the world's oceans within weeks. The frigate was prototype and proof of concept, and everything that followed built upon what it had demonstrated. This is the frigate's true legacy. Not the hanging of pirates, though that was dramatic. Not the treasure recovered and the sea lane secured, though that was profitable. But the establishment of the principle that oceanic space could be governed, that sufficient investment in the right kind of warship could make the state's authority effective across thousands of miles of open water. That principle, first proven against the pirates of the Golden Age, has shaped the world we inhabit. It made possible the colonial empires of the 19th century. It made possible the global trade networks of the 20th. It makes possible today the container ships that carry the goods we consume and the naval patrols that ensure those ships reach their destinations unimpeded. The ocean we know is the ocean the frigate made. But memory operates by its own logic, and in memory the relationship inverts. We do not remember the frigate. We remember the pirate. Every child who has ever tied a bandana around their head and pretended to search for treasure is remembering something that the frigate destroyed. Every novel and film and video game that conjures the romance of the Golden Age is mourning a world that the fifth rate made impossible. The pirates live on in imagination because they represent something we have lost. Call it freedom, call it adventure, call it the capacity to imagine a life unconstrained by institutional authority, and the mechanism of their destruction has been conveniently forgotten. This forgetting is itself significant. It tells us something about how we process the victories of order over disorder, civilization over wildness, state power over individual autonomy. We celebrate the disorder retrospectively, safely, from within the boundaries of the order that replaced it. We tell ourselves stories about pirates while living in a world that pirates could not have made and would not have survived. We romanticize the very thing whose extinction made our lives possible. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the romance is a form of tribute to what was lost, a way of acknowledging that something valuable was sacrificed when the ocean was tamed. Perhaps the children playing pirate are keeping alive a memory that would otherwise disappear entirely, preserving in diminished form the wildness that the frigate suppressed. Or perhaps the romance is simply distraction, a way of not confronting the true nature of the order we inhabit, the violence that founded it, the constraints it imposes in exchange for the security it provides. These are questions that the evidence cannot answer. The archives give us logistics and kill counts, patrol routes and prize money distributions, the administrative machinery of suppression. They do not give us access to what the suppression felt like, either to the suppressors or the suppressed. The inner lives of the men who sailed these ships, the captains and the ordinary seamen, the pirates and the pirate hunters, remain largely inaccessible. We know what they did. We know within margins of error when and where they did it, why they did it, what they hoped for and feared, what they believed about the lives they were living. These are the things the records do not contain. What we can say is this: in the early decades of the 18th century, a technological innovation combined with an institutional commitment to produce a transformation in the governance of oceanic space. The frigate, deployed systematically across the major shipping routes of the Atlantic world, eliminated piracy as a significant threat to maritime commerce. The elimination was deliberate, was conscious, was celebrated by the men who achieved it. What they could not see, what we can see only in retrospect, is that the elimination was also inaugural, that it established patterns of maritime control that would extend and intensify for centuries, that would make the ocean into a governed space continuous with the land, that would enable forms of extraction and exploitation that dwarfed anything the pirates had ever attempted. The Swallow lies in harbor somewhere, her bones rotted away or salvaged for timber, or sunk beneath the waves of some estuary whose name the records do not preserve. The men who crewed her are dust, their individual graves long since lost, their names preserved only in paybooks that almost no one will ever read. The pirates they hunted are dust too, their bodies scattered across the African coast and the Caribbean basin, their names more famous than their killers, but no more material, no more present in the world that their deaths made possible. The waves that carried all of them still move. The same Atlantic that Roberts sailed and Ogle patrolled is the Atlantic that container ships cross today, carrying goods made possible by the global economy that naval power secured. The same wind that filled the Swallow's sails fills the sails of whatever pleasure craft are out there now, sailing waters that have been safe for so long that the safety seems natural, seems like a feature of the ocean itself, rather than an achievement that required specific ships and specific men and specific decisions. The safety is not natural. The safety was made. The making cost lives on both sides, the pirates who died and the sailors who hunted them, the enslaved people whose transportation the pirates interrupted, and the merchants whose profits the pirates stole. All of them contributed, knowingly or unknowingly, to the construction of a world in which oceanic space is subject to state authority, in which the seas are ruled by the same logic that governs the land, in which the wild Atlantic that Bartholomew Roberts briefly dominated has been domesticated beyond his recognition. He stood on the deck of the Royal Fortune on the morning of February 10th, 1722, in a crimson waistcoat and a diamond cross, and he looked out at Challoner Ogle's squadron emerging from the morning mist. He knew in that moment that his time had come. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that his time was everyone's time, that what was ending was not just his life and his career, but an entire way of being on the ocean, a possibility of maritime existence that the frigate was permanently foreclosing. He raised his glass. He gave his orders. He sailed out to meet the ships that would destroy him, and in destroying him would remake the world. The frigate made the ocean, we know. The pirate, by his extinction, proved it could be made. There is nothing more to say. The sea does not remember the men who sailed it. The archives preserve what the archives preserve. The rest is silence and the sound of waves and the long patience of water that was here before any of this happened and will be here long after the last trace of it has dissolved into the indifferent Atlantic. Somewhere beneath those waves, a diamond cross catches no light.